Hi. Hello. This is another session in a conference, and I've been networking on the networking session, which is something like a fluid thing. You can just move around, and then when you bump into people, you're able to talk to them and see them and speak to them. And yeah, we were just discussing that stopping projects is quite hard, it seems. I mean, it seems that almost anyone can start a project, but actually stop doing it or abandoning it or completely killing it is quite difficult, and I haven't seen it much in my career. So we have a nice subject for today, going to be presented by Louise Worsley. And Louise is from South Africa, and she is combining consultancy with a lecturing role at the University of Cape Town. And she is doing the leadership module for Masters in Project Management. She's an author, and yeah, she's really into stakeholder-centric approaches. Apart from that, she's also a global PMO awards judge and the former chair of the South Africa's PMO judging committee. So yeah, let's welcome Louise to the stage. Hi, Louise. How are you today?
So much, Remco. Thank you very much. Let me see if I can seamlessly share my screen.
Yeah.
I will do that now.
That's good. And I'll leave it to you afterwards, and enjoy, everyone.
Now we have set up a poll. I can't currently see it. I'm hoping that you can see a poll. It's that graphy thing in the right-hand side. So feel free to look at those polls and enter them as I'm going along, and then we'll use that perhaps to think about some of the questions towards the end. So hi everybody. I want you to picture this. You're driving a car and it's low on fuel. And if you're my daughter, that seems to be how she drives her car. I don't know if you've got a daughter like that, but it's not just the fuel. The warning lights are coming on. There's strange noises coming out from underneath the bonnet. There's the people in the back of the car are tapping you on the shoulders and saying, "What's happening here? Where are we going? What's happening here?" And yet, crazily enough, you just keep on driving. You go past the petrol station, you go past the repair garages, you just keep on going, hoping that somewhere or other you're going to get to your destination. And that's how I pretty much view projects that are clearly struggling, but they just won't stop. They just keep going past that petrol station. They just don't stop and say, "Oh, can you help me with this?" They just keep going and going. So I'm Louise Worsley. I'm joining you today on my very first PMO Leadership Conference. And as Remco was saying, when I'm not at the University of Cape Town, where I teach leadership and stakeholder engagement, I'm working in portfolio management. And it was in 2008 that I first started to think about this question. How do you go about killing projects? And it was because in that year, I was working for a consultancy group, and a pressing inquiry came through the door from one of our clients, and it turned out to be several of our clients said, "Yes, I want to talk about this too." And the question was, how do we pull the brakes on projects that seem to have a mind of their own? And that mind of their own, that's the phrase they use, these projects that seem to have this great, they have their minds of their own. There is work on that. That led me to write a paper, and I presented at the Australian Institute of Project Management in 2008, 2009. And what was interesting there was it was clear from the audience that it had touched a nerve. There are a number of people in the audience who said, "Yeah, I'm not sure we're really doing this at all. I'm not sure we really are closing down projects appropriately." So let's go down to it. How on earth do we stop those runaway projects? Why were our clients worried? Well, there were two clear problems that they were worrying away at. And the first, there was this growing understanding that they simply couldn't deliver everything that was in their portfolio at the moment. And I think that's a problem that many of us face right now. It was just impossible to deliver everything in their portfolio with the resources they had. There was this disconnect. Our clients were facing this disconnect between what they'd hoped to achieve and what was humanly possible. And to give you some perspective on some of the challenges they were facing, when we looked at their portfolios, I think a staggering 30 to 40% of the projects in their portfolios were not new challenges. They'd actually been instigated at least a year ago. So they were last year's problems. And some of the projects, between 5 and 10% of them, were these let's do it again projects, if you like, coming from previous years, were more than 3 or 4 years old. And yet they were still taking up time and effort on their portfolios. And yet new projects were coming in and they couldn't get rid of the old ones. New projects kept piling up. And there was this massive chunk of resources which was still devoted to issues that were identified ages ago. And the second problem, well, strangely, Remco started to talk about this. Green lighting, getting going on a new project is so much more exciting, so much more exhilarating than stopping one. So like pressing the start button on an exciting new journey, that's what new projects are like. But hitting the brakes on a current project, well, that's where things get a little bit trickier. And decision makers find it way tougher, way more difficult to pull the plug than to plug in. So they find it much more difficult to kill projects. Management decision-making around stopping a project just seems so much harder than approving a project to start. Now, for us animal lovers out there, I apologize for these pictures, and I suspect if you're like me, you're probably going, how can you possibly kill those little pigs? How can you possibly kill badgers? It creates this emotional response in us. Well, it turns out stopping projects also creates an emotional response. It creates an emotional response in our teams, people who are involved in it and are now being told, no, just go away, or in our contractors who are on contracts and are financially dependent upon it. It creates emotional responses in our management teams who've made that commitment to wanting to get these outcomes. For those of you listening from the UK, and it may be news in Europe too, you may be aware of the political, social and academic reactions to the plan to stopping phase 2 of HS2, which is this high-speed rail project linking Birmingham and eventually Manchester to central London. Well, we now know that the Manchester link will not happen. And we will be saving, or the government will be saving, £32 billion, which they do plan to use in different ways. And just as an aside, the UK isn't the only place where high-speed train projects struggle. The Californian high-speed rail project to connect LA to San Francisco, well, it hasn't. For the $23 million, it's connected, and I apologize to my American colleagues here, I'm probably saying this wrong, it's connected Merced and Bakersfield, which is pretty much like saying it's the bullet train to nowhere. So why is this happening? In examining 3 of our clients' big portfolios where they had attempted to stop a lot of projects, we discovered something surprising. Over 30% of supposedly curtailed projects which are supposed to have stopped, were still making waves. There were still people working on them. They just weren't under the portfolio spotlight. They weren't being reported on, but there was still effort going against them. On paper, they were marked as complete, but in practice, resources were still being allocated and used. Now why is it so challenging to halt a project? I think we should think of stopping a project as trying to halt this mammoth oil tanker in mid-ocean. Once a project is past its initiation and out of the dock, it's not just cruising, it's accelerating. So slapping the brakes on without due process can cause a lot of unforeseen consequences and wide-reaching problems. So I've been reliably informed by a friend of mine who runs a shipping company, and he tells me that redirecting an oil tanker isn't simply about steering it another way. There are protocols, there are port approvals, They are renegotiated, loading contracts, whatever they happen to be, maritime service notifications, and much, much more. The process is layered and it's intricate. So similarly, in the world of project management, projects are intricately linked in the portfolio. They share resources. They're impacting similar business operations, and they're delivered related and often interlinked outcomes. The intertwining of these factors doesn't just lead to delays, and of course it does lead to delays, it also places immense psychological pressure on the team, often compelling them to think, perhaps we should just finish this, perhaps we should just do a little bit more, even when pressing that pause or stopping the project might be more strategic, might be more logical. I suspect the next comments we will see about that high-speed train in the UK in the press about HS2 will be, why wasn't it halted sooner? And I think there's probably already been some of that. And as I said, I think the real blunt truth is stopping is incredibly challenging, especially for large infrastructure projects and especially for political projects, where the wheels of commitment are set in motion. This is particularly pronounced in political projects, let's face it. So if you look at what, for example, Senator Denton said in 1984, to pull the plug on a project where there's been $1.1 billion spent seems like a grave misuse of taxpayers' dollars. And that's the weight, the escalation of commitment. It's not just the financial burden. It's not just that $1.1 billion. It's like, how can we do this? What are people going to think? And you can imagine the political environment. That's even worse. It's a psychological commitment. It's that invisible anchor that holds projects in place when the signs suggest we really should be changing course. So this deep-rooted commitment shapes decisions about project termination, and we need to be aware of that when we try and make those terminations occur. Even when a project is officially ended, the echoes of that commitment can still be heard. And how do you see those? How might you see those in your organization? Well, there may be continued debate between the senior leadership. Even though the decision we feel has been made, there may be people saying, I'm not sure we should be doing that. Senior leadership saying, have we made the right decision there? Do you think, what about doing just a little bit of this? They might rally against that termination. You might find that some of the wrapping up activities start to drag, and some might continue working under the project radar, covertly, secretly in some way or another. Or in one case we found in our portfolios we looked at, there's this audacious approach, this kind of brave approach where the project just kept going and just assumed, well, if we just keep going, somebody else's project will be stopped, won't it? So that I've started, so I'll finish commitment runs really deep. And its shadows can be rather long in terms of the way it impacts our resources and our ability to regain stuff from stopping a project. So two researchers ventured deeper into how these commitment levels shift over time. And their focus was on what they saw as two pivotal factors. First was the need for information from our stakeholders as the project progresses. And the second one was the growing demand for the project to complete as we go through the project life cycle. So as a project starts, you will know there's this thirst for information. Everybody's asking questions. Everybody wants to be involved in describing it and getting their input in. The information demands from stakeholders is unquenchable. They're brimming with questions. What's the rationale behind this? How much will it cost? How much will come out of my budget and how much will come out of her budget? What changes is it going to bring about for me and how will it impact us? There's lots of questions. They're striving to grasp that full picture, to comprehend the financial implications, the resource implications, the operational implications, and the expected ROI. And this quest for clarity, in turn, fosters that higher commitment. It's great because now they're starting to talk about it. It creates a higher commitment. Either they love it or they hate it and they become opponents, but it creates that commitment for the project to go forward. But as the project trudges forward, the frequency of these probing questions, according to these researchers, appears to dwindle. And it's replaced by a much more growing need for, let's get it going, let's finish it, let's wrap it up, that need for project completion. So stage gates are supposed to be the governance way of reawakening that questioning process, that rise of the inquisitive spirit. But when we looked at these various portfolios, the one thing that came out quite clearly really was that halting projects after the first stage gate was relatively rare. So what was envisaged as these rigorous stage gates as we go through our projects often kind of changed or morphed into mere formalities, rather stage walkthroughs than stage gates. And the other thing that was happening was that the mandal, who felt that they were involved in the authorization, instead of it resting with the key decision makers, it often got passed on to technical teams, people who were really better placed to make approval decisions rather than authorization to proceed to decisions, and they weren't asking the right questions. So the consequence of this was this drift from informed governance to almost like a procedural tick. So we've looked at that Herculean challenge of projects. How do we get them to stop? But there is an even greater monster. And that's, even if we stop them, how do we get the actual rewards of the halt? How do we get the benefits of halting them? Because halting a project can actually become a dual blow to the project performance. Because on one hand, you don't get the benefits. And on the other, if you don't execute the termination correctly, you may not get the anticipated benefits from halting the project. So when sifting through projects to decide which to axe, which to get rid of, it's not just about the act of stopping. The real question is if we stop this project, can we really utilize the resources it releases? Can we really get it that expenditure and use it on other projects? If we've got long-term contracts, for example, going on, can we really break those contracts and bring that money back into our portfolio? It's about liberating the resources. How swiftly and efficiently can we liberate those resources? And can they be used by other projects? And then, of course, there's this kind of allure of, if we save this money, look what we can do in the future, this allure of fresh projects. So if we're culling projects in our portfolio so we can do something else, how quickly can we kickstart those new projects? When will the benefits materialize? Going back to our HS2 example, take Rishi Sunak's pledge of allocating 32 billion for enhanced northern transport. There's a whole load of questions, but I think the three really important ones are, when will this fund be available? How will it be employed? And when will its value become realizable, become palpable? When will we get the value from that? And these aren't just political questions. These are fundamental portfolio management challenges, fundamental portfolio questions that we have to answer when we're culling projects. So good news, among the many projects we looked at when we were talking to these clients, we did find one that had been halted during the execution stage. And yet, even though it had been halted, it was seen as one of the big success projects that year. It was a bit of a triumph in the project portfolio. Bit of a surprise when you consider it actually didn't complete to the end. So why was it in the end a success? And its success seemed to hinge on the process of closing down that project. So there'd been a review gate, they'd prompted those inquisitive questions, people had been involved, stakeholders had been involved in answering those questions and in coming to what they felt was a united decision. The approach to closing it down was meticulous. They spent real time on gleaning the residual benefits and working out, okay, so we've done this amount, what can we do with what we've created so far? They made sure that the rationale for termination was well communicated between the stakeholders. And the essence of this was that even when you stop a project in the middle, in a way that's not the normal stop, you just said, no, that's it, that's enough, then you can still make it a success if you close it down in the good way. Now, what does that mean? Normal Project closeout, by that I mean plan. We've been through our plan stage, execution stage, and now we're in closeout. That last closeout stage typically takes between 3 and 10% of a project's total expenditure and elapsed time. That's quite a small amount, and I think that's reflected in the literature we have around project closure, normal project closure. There's much discussion in that literature around making sure that we do things like knowledge management, feeding back the lessons learned back into the project and portfolio realm, and also, of course, that pivotal transition to the operational side. But there's often less around that critical act of handling the project outputs to their future custodians to make sure they get real value from it, to get those benefits. There's often less around that. And there's also, beyond those technical things, there isn't that much telling us about how do we deal with the emotional aspects of closing down the project? How do we make sure the stakeholders are aware that the project's closed down and what has happened and how their input has been used? And this last thing becomes even more important when a project is facing an untimely end, when it's been culled. And that's partly because once there's a rumour around that a project is going to stop, everybody's going, oh, let's go. I don't want to be here anymore. Let's just go try and find our next project as quickly as possible. Let's get off this failed project and let's start to get involved with something else. And because of that, the closeout phase can be a bit hasty, can be abbreviated. But the trouble is that this unnatural termination doesn't necessarily mean we can do a quick close. These are some of the preliminary figures we got from relatively low numbers of projects, but it gives you some ideas of how long it takes to stop a project during the project life cycle. So at initiation, if you stop a project, that's stage gate 1, not an uncommon thing to do, maybe 1 to 2% of the elapsed time, just to make sure people are aware, close the business case down and do the communication. But by the time you get to execution, it can take between 5 and 25% of the elapsed time so far on the project. So to give you a feel for that, if you have been running on a 2-year project and it stopped in execution stage, it could take up to 6 months for it to close down effectively. Now, HS2, here's some perspectives from our study. So HS2, that's been going for, you may know better than me, but I think it's at least 6 years. That's a real ocean tanker of a stop. So when projects face this premature curtain call, you've got to stop, there's this heightened need for an elongated closeout. And I don't mean let's keep going. I mean, there's this heightened need for a process for closing that project down. And it's not just about tidying up. It's about salvaging residual value. It's about ensuring that the culling that we're doing injects the tangible worth back into our portfolios. So, in summary, if the car is showing lots of lights and it's making a loud noise, then we probably ought to think about whether we should be continuing with this project. We need to beware these runaway projects. And remember, from our findings, and I'd be love to know what your thoughts are about in your own portfolios, if over 30 to 40% of projects in the portfolio were actually instigated 1, 2, 3 years ago, are those really the projects we should be investing in today? Are those addressing today's problems, or are they addressing problems that we've now moved on from? Escalation of commitment. We know initiating projects is great. We seem to be better at doing that. And indeed, all of the clients we talked to had very good portfolio prioritization processes. But they would be the first to admit that in terms of stopping projects, that process there was very weak and wasn't recognized as a formal process in portfolio management. So an interesting thing to know from you is, do you recognize that as a formal process in your portfolio management? The problem with the escalation of commitment comes from that fact that people get psychologically committed, they get politically committed, and they find it very difficult to then make that decision, perhaps we should stop this project. Stage gates are our tools. We really need to be using those effectively. And they're designed as checks and balances, but I think what we've got to do is to use the words from those researchers. I think they use some great words, which is, we need to use stage gates to reawaken that inquisitiveness in our clients, in our stakeholders, that inquisitiveness and that ability to ask the questions, to ask the business questions, to ask the portfolio strategic questions, if we're going to genuinely use stage gates to help us in portfolio management and to help us in culling. And project termination is not just a case of stopping it and then walking away. A successful termination has got to get those residual benefits. It has got to make sure that people feel that the decision was transparent. They understand the decision. Your stakeholders have been involved in your project and now you're saying, don't worry about it anymore. They want to know why this has happened and you need to go back to them. So by doing that, a well-handled termination can actually turn into a project success. And that closing phase, though it's often underestimated, we need to be particularly aware that potentially, and I'm going to perhaps make this more than potentially, I think that the closing that we do when we are culling projects is a different process from the closing we do when we just stop a project. And we need to think very carefully about how we go through that. How do we make HS2 and the money, that 32 billion, available back into our portfolio? How do we manage that process? So I guess the call to action for me is, I think that after project selection, then culling is one of the most important, maybe not even after, with project selection. Culling is one of the most important parts of portfolios. It's one of the most important contributions that senior management make to our portfolio, strategic portfolio processes. And without a process for determining and following through the termination, then our project culling is just going to become subjective, political, tactical, dog-eat-dog type of thing if we don't have a process for doing that. So I'm going to leave you with this question. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your views. How is this working on your portfolio? Have you found a way of making it that important part of portfolio management in your organizations? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing here. I've got lots of questions. I'd like to hear from you about how that has gone for you, and whether you are involved in stopping projects and how you've come about doing it. Remco, do you want to show us what the poll results show? Okay, I think Remco's just put up the poll there. So if you haven't had a go at that, please do.
Yeah, poll's still open. I can only show one on the screen at once, but the polls are open and you can vote. There's the votes coming in. So if you haven't voted yet, please do so now, and then I'll close the polls in a few seconds. All right, I'll close the polls. And I'll show them on stage. I don't know if you see them. No, you only see one. So let me. The first one is on stage, Louise, and if you want to have the results of the second one, just let me know.
Okay. Can I actually can't see the results? Can anybody else see the results? No, I don't know. I don't know. If you can see them, fantastic. Hopefully it'll give you some idea about people's experiences in that. I see that we've got a couple of questions and some thoughts in the in the chat sections. Karsten Florin, issue of sunk cost fallacy. Yes, it is, absolutely. And much of our stuff on commitment comes from the idea of sunk cost, that we can't move on from it. And that's a financial side, but there's this psychological side. And that need to normalize culling. Yes, absolutely, Irina. That would be my call out to people, is how do we make this a normal part of that process? And how do we ensure that this actually works within our portfolios? Let's have a look at one of the questions. I found the core issue is that fellow projects do not feel that they should have a say or speak up. They fear being singled out, and there's a problem of group bias. Yeah, I think that relates back to some of the concerns around the way that stage gates get done. A couple of years back now, I was involved with a group in the Cayman Islands. It was a government group. They were all senior government people. And we were talking about benefits realization. And one of the takeaways that they took away was that when they went to meetings, they shouldn't be talking about the status of projects. The only thing they should worry about is they go back to the benefits, back to success factors, and they ask questions about that. And I think that's something that we really, really need to encourage, that inquisitive question making, but allowing them to do it around, not steer them into the project status. That's not where their decision making, but into things like, well, is it still valuable to us? And we need to encourage those discussions. And from your perspective, how is it better to manage the objection of the stakeholders that project closure equals the PM's fault, as even if budget time were met, but the expectations were not met? I think that's a really interesting one. I think the project I talked about, when I talked to the project manager, I was very impressed by how much time they spent with the stakeholders, going back to them to tell them about why the decision was that they had stopped the project. And I think in general, if we look at stakeholder engagement, obviously it's an area of a lot of interest to me. I often find that we're very good at opening up stakeholder relationships and stakeholder communications, but we don't close them down as well as we ought to. We don't go back and tell the stakeholders, you know, I talked to you 3 months about this project. This is what happened to it. This is why it happened to it. And I think that closure process, one of the really important parts of the closure process is the closing down of the stakeholder engagements. And I think that will help us in terms of moving it away from being something about the PM's fault to being something about this being a managed decision that stakeholders have been involved with. Because we don't want that. We don't want the project managers simply being blamed for this. Okay, any more questions, or let me just look at the discussion again. Carsten, Florian, you were saying that you find it easier to do that challenge, and that's partly because you've been given the role of it. There's an interesting concept which I think is real. It's the idea in Israel of the 10th man. And the 10th man in strategic decision-making or in decision-making is the person whose job it is to question. And that's their job. It's not that they're a horrible person or that they are always negative. So, and it can vary. You could be the 10th person this time around, and you can be the 10th person that time around. But it's a known role that you are to look at. What are the negatives about this? Why shouldn't we close this down? And I think by recognizing that this person's just been given that role, it's no longer an argument ad hominem. You're not being nasty about a person. You're using a process to create that open debate. Okay, and a few things here where people have stopped projects, which is fantastic. I'm just looking at questions, if there's anything else at all. And of course, if you want to talk to me about this, and if you were on the previous session and you saw me talking about the academic stuff we're doing PM Leader, please do reach out to me. Both on academia and bringing together academia and business, and also on culling, because I really think this is something we need to promote in portfolio management. I'd love to hear some of your views about how you think that works. Remco, I think we're about there. Have I lost Remco? Yes, I think we're about there.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and debate. For all the other people, there's plenty of time networking, like I mentioned in the beginning. There are booths, there's a networking area. So please stick around, make new personal relationships, and make sure to visit the other presentations as well. Thank you.
Bye now. Bye.